Welcome, listeners, to Derry Public Radio. Reporting from the basement of the Derry Civic Center, this is CM Alexander with the news. Ewan High in nearby Chamberlain is having their first prom in almost 40 years. All nearby fire departments have been notified. And now, the weather. Cloudy with a 50% chance of hail, followed by stones. This is Derry Public Radio. This is Derry Public Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of Derry Public Radio. I am Joshua Kahn, one of your hosts for the Stephen King podcast. Joined with me is Benjamin Graham. Ben, how are you?
Long days and pleasant nights, Josh.
And CM Alexander. How are you?
Great. How's it going?
Oh, living the dream, man. Very excited to get this first episode of our podcast underway.
Yeah.
We're going to start things off by just kind of like telling you a little bit about us because this is the first episode and you have no basis of knowing who we are or what we do. So first things first, we're going to talk about the form of our show. Like the point of the show is to delve into the works of Stephen King. And actually, Ben is responsible for bringing this idea to the table.
Damn straight.
So why don't you kick things off, let us know how that came to be.
All right. Well, I've been wanting to do this for a long time, more or less just as an excuse to reread everything Stephen King has ever written. Because recently I actually started reading Sleeping Beauties, which is his currently latest book that he wrote with his son Owen. And it's the first Stephen King book I've read in a decade that reminds me of his like peak Stephen King style. And I was really excited to talk about it. And I know, Josh, you're one of the very few people that are as into the Dark Tower series as I am.
For sure.
Which is another thing I'm very excited to talk about. I could rant about the Dark Tower forever. And that was kind of the basis. And then you introduced me to our third co-host, CM. I'm excited to get started.
Yeah. So, and the reason, obviously, CM is the perfect choice for this is you have quite an interesting collection. Why don't you tell people about your fantastic Stephen King collection?
Yes, I have a ton of Stephen King books. I actually got a friend of mine into the Dark Tower series because it's my favorite series, and he loved it so much that he decided to seek out a first edition copy, which I thought was nuts because those are very expensive, and I really loved and appreciated my worn, beaten copy that I'd read probably like 3 or 4 times. So he actually found one for a pretty fair price and brought it over to my house, and I was still feeling that, wow, man, this is messed up. I'm not even that far gone. And I don't know what happened, but I think it took me maybe a week, I started looking.
It awakened something dark in you immediately.
Yeah, I don't recommend ever buying a first edition copy. Never, because now I have.
He'll take it from you.
I have 6 bookshelves.
I need them.
I have 6 bookshelves full of books. A lot, first editions,
Jesus.
signed, gift editions. It's just it's like a spiral of, yeah. It's my only bad habit.
Going down that rabbit hole pretty hard.
That's really funny because my collection is the polar opposite of that. All of my Stephen King books are the hand-me-down copies my dad gave me. The copy of Carrie that I have, Carrie, the book that we will be discussing today, is more yellow than white and just half torn apart.
I actually think that's better. That is way better than the beautiful like anniversary edition that I have. I'm
humble
not being
brag.
It's just,
I really wish my beautiful, expensive first edition was just torn to shreds. It's just too perfect.
That's an entirely different conversation too. Like, do we value those brand new shiny ones, or do we appreciate the ones that our parents gave us and we've beaten around a bunch?
Yeah, right.
I have both. I have
You have plenty.
paperback copies.
I'd like something in between because literally my copy of it is more tape than book. Like,
that's amazing.
it is.
Well, speaking of some of the other books, what was your guys' introduction to Stephen King? Do you remember what the first Stephen King book you ever read?
You can start.
Sure, thanks. Yes, I was going to North Carolina for my brother's wedding. I was in, I think, 7th grade, going into 8th grade maybe, and we were at the airport, and I realized I didn't know what I was going to do on the plane with my mom and grandma for all these hours. And so we stopped in the bookstore at the airport, and the first thing I saw was actually Rose Madder by Stephen King. So I just grabbed that because I needed something. And that was the very first Stephen King book I read. And that book I have upstairs. It's got like holes all over it. And it's
That's
just
cool.
beaten
Still
up.
have the original.
Yeah, I did buy the signed copy though to go with it.
Of course you did.
But once I read that, that was it. I was done. I was hooked.
I still haven't read that one. Excited to get to that one.
We'll add it to the list
Is that
for
the one
podcast.
starring Kathy Bates? No, that's Dolores Claiborne.
There is not a movie
right?
of that one,
Yeah, okay.
unfortunately.
How about you, Ben? What was your first Stephen King?
My first Stephen King book, first, like my earliest memory of Stephen King, goes back to when I was a little kid, living in my house. My dad had a bookcase in our basement, and I was terrified of the basement, which is stupid because it was a furnished basement. Like, it was a nice basement, but I was terrified because there was a bookcase that my dad had all of his Stephen King books on. And I would go down there, I'd sneak down there, and I'd just look at the covers. And a lot of them freaked me out, but the cover of It, the classic, the green reptilian hand reaching out of the sewer grate with the paper boat next to it, just filled my little brain with primal fear. Like, just looking at the cover of that book would give me nightmares. And I swore to myself as a little kid, I am never reading these books. Like, these books are too fucking scary. I do not like it. And it was the summer after 8th grade, after middle school, that I was down in the basement with my dad and looking at these books like I often would, because as scared of them as I was just drawn to them. There was just something mysterious and like, these are beyond me, you know? And I was staring at him, and my dad's like, go ahead, pick one up, read one. I'm like, no, they're too scary. And he's like, they're not that scary, come on, here. And he picked out The Stand, complete and uncut. Like 1,500 page long book. Like, just absolutely, and the cover with the Jesus analog and the crow monster fighting. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And it took me an entire summer. I remember I took that book everywhere with me. My mom would take me out on errands, and I would sit in the car and read. And it took me the entire summer, but after that, I spent the entirety of high school reading nothing but Stephen King. And, that's what got me hooked.
My God. Starting with The Stand, that's
Wow.
great. So every other book you started reading after that, like in one day, you're like, oh, is that it? Your brain was conditioned to an epic.
I'm a slow reader, honestly. It's, but yeah, that was, to this day, probably one of my favorite books of all time. The Stand. I have reread it 3-4 times, listened to the audiobook twice. I can't get enough.
That's
so
awesome.
good.
That's killer.
How about you, Josh?
When I was, let's see, I think I was probably like 19 or 20. My first serious girlfriend, she got me into Stephen King because it's like her favorite author of all time, and she has like tons of his books. As a matter of fact, when we talked about doing this show, I sent her a text immediately and was like, hey, you're going to want to listen to a podcast now. And she had recommended a couple books, and I want to say the first book of his that I read was Needful Things.
Oh, good choice.
And, well, because I can't remember if it was I either read it and then Needful Things or the other way around, but I know I read those two like back to back.
Either way.
Yeah, like they're both phenomenal books. And I just remember like as I was the way Needful Things, like the dominoes that book sets up from like Jump Street, and you can just tell, all right, something like is going on here. And then by the end of the book, it's just madness.
That's the ending of that book, like the whole last like third of that book is just
Oh yeah, it's
amazing.
fucking great. Well, and the other thing, and the
And-
thing that made me the most interested in reading more of his stuff is that because Needful Things is the last Castle Rock book, if I recall, and so it has references to so many other Castle Rock books. Where I was like, I think there was like a Cujo reference, and I'm like, I was familiar with what Cujo was, but I'd never like seen the movie or read the book. But I was like, it's prominent enough that I can pick up on it. So I wonder how many things I would catch if I just read everything.
That's awesome that like I didn't get a glimpse of the interconnectedness of the King universe until several books in. Like I didn't realize that everything is the Tower until, I don't know, 3 years after I read The Stand when I stumbled onto those. So that's kind of cool that you had that from the very beginning. It's one of my favorite parts of King's writing.
Yeah. Well, and having like somebody who like she'd read all these books, so like I would be able to be like, hey, so this is weird, and she'd be like, oh, this is from this book, this crazy thing happens, and I was like, what the hell is going on? Like just super like into it right away.
Isn't Rose Matter like heavily connected to the Tower as well?
Yep, there's some elements, and I don't want to spoil anything since you already read that one.
Please,
'cause it's
please.
awesome, but yeah, that is one.
Oh.
I think you could make the argument that it's in a lot. I even Carrie.
Man, I'm super excited to like. I know you've got something to talk about with that, so I'm very excited
Yeah.
to get to that
Let's
later
go.
on in the show. So that's who we are. That's how we got here. Before we jump into our book club style discussion of part 1 of Carrie, because we're going to split this up into 2 parts. So this episode will be the introduction from us, and then part 1 of Carrie. So if you just want to stop the podcast right now and go read it, if you haven't read it, just read
Highly
part 1.
recommended.
And we'll be here when
Wait,
you get back.
They haven't already read it.
Well,
Why
they
haven't you guys already read it?
I don't know.
Didn't you know this podcast was coming? Aren't you prepared?
Didn't you conceive this podcast would exist and it would start with Carrie? So before we get into Carrie, I just want to do a quick go around of, is there any book that we are going to do that you are super looking forward to? Like that you can't wait for the other 2 of us to read it? Because I have probably the least knowledge about Stephen King books. I've definitely read the fewest between the 3 of us. So most of the things we'll read probably going to be new to me. Like Carrie, this is the first time I've ever read Carrie.
I envy you. Oh God, so many.
I asked for 1, Ben. 1.
Well, that's too bad. As much as I'm excited to reread the classics, like It, I haven't read in years. I'm very excited to go back through that. And The Stand, one of my favorites. I'm more excited to read some of the lesser known ones. Stuff like The Dark Half. His like really weird, kind of angrier books. The Tommyknockers. I'm very excited to go. Have you ever read The Tommyknockers, Sam?
I have not. No.
You haven't. It is the strangest book. It is, without spoiling anything, bonkers. It is
Solid
it
review.
is cocaine in book form. It's crazy.
Oh, is it Max Overdrive?
Yeah, it's that nuts. So I'm excited to read that. And then in a different vein, I'm very excited to talk about how much I hate the book Under the Dome. I
Good. All right.
really, really, really dislike that book for a number of reasons. It'll be fun to talk about.
I've read none of those, so that'll be fantastic.
right.
CM?
Oh man, okay. To make
I said
it
one,
long,
goddamn
I know. Well, hey, okay, here's my one. Well, obviously there's Rose Matter, and then there's Long Walk, Tears of the Dragon. Am I saying that?
Eyes of the
Eyes
Dragon.
of the Dragon. I don't know why I always say Tears.
Flag is in that book.
And oh shoot, I just lost it.
Oh no.
Just a ton.
Yeah.
So many.
Too many.
Basically every book that's on your shelves.
Yeah. Oh, I got it. 11/22/63, which is more recent. And Ben, I believe you have not.
I
read
have
that one
read
yet?
that.
Oh, you have. You have. Yes.
I have some
You didn't
opinions
care
on
for
that.
it, which that's okay.
right.
I don't know why. That one, something about it got me.
I loved it until the ending, and oh boy, do I have some opinions about Stephen King's ability to write an ending.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Cool.
I don't remember the end. Well, I don't remember the ending of Carrie. Yes, I remember the ending of Carrie, but not in great detail. So next episode will be fun.
Yeah, it'll be very exciting. Like, I know the story because I've seen like every iteration
Pop
of the
culture
movie.
in the past 40 years.
Exactly. But I'm excited to like see how it's actually written.
Yeah.
So with that, why don't we go ahead and jump into
do it.
into Carrie? Let's knock this out. So first thing, we should talk about the style of Carrie because, again, I had never read it. So when I started reading this, I was instantly like, "What is happening?"
Yeah.
Because it's told in that style of, this is what's currently happening. These are books written about what's happening, and not even necessarily about the incident, but about telekinesis. What did you guys think about that? Oh wait, sorry. Before we get to that, hey, you guys have both of you read this book before?
Yes.
Ben has.
Years and
Yeah,
years and
this
years
is my
ago.
third time, but it's not one that sticks in my mind for some reason.
No. If I were going to, for reasons other than a podcast, reread Carrie, I would reread Firestarter instead. Like,
There.
that's just a very similar kind of content and ideas, but more actiony.
Sure, aren't because they're like both based around like
They're
Like-
like mental superpowers.
Right,
They're
right.
both like X-Men books.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so I'm the only one who had no idea what I was getting into.
Yes.
All right, so what's your guys' take on the style of the format of this book?
I like it. It definitely reads like a first book, I think. Famously, Carrie is Stephen King's first published novel, and the format of the like found articles is slightly jarring, especially in the copy I have, where after the article segments, there's an ellipses, and then it just goes right back into the present day telling of the story. And maybe it had something to do with me reading it at 4 o'clock in the morning, but there were several times where I did not realize that the newspaper segment had ended, and now we are in present day, and the tense made me go, wait, what? Like,
Not
it
just
threw me
you.
off. Yeah. Several times. I was like, wait, who's talking right now? Who's...
Well, especially when it jumps from an excerpt from Sue Snell's book to her narrative.
Yeah.
Like, oh wait, what is happening right now?
Yeah, a little confusing. All in all, I like it. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. There were a few times that I kind of had to go back and reread a paragraph because I didn't realize who was talking.
Yep.
I did think it was interesting. I have read a few other books that use that similar style with a lot of interviews or journal entries, and I've seen it. I hate saying this because I'm not a writer and I don't like to say things like this, but I've seen it done better there. And obviously, this was one of his earlier ones, and it's
yeah.
amazing. But I think that I do really enjoy that style. It's just pulling it off successfully can be a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, I have definitely read stories that are written as like journal entries or whatever, but switching back and forth between journal entries and then just regular prose. I think I would have preferred it if he had gone all the way, where it was all told in like, this happened in the past and whatnot, rather than switching back and forth.
Well, but if you do that, then you lose all of the the internal monologue, which is another thing that
True.
this book does. Not just with Carrie. Like, I would have assumed her character is the only internal monologue we would get by the way the story goes, but there are several characters that you get that glimpse into the little bracketed
But
what's in their head.
I don't know. It kind of goes against, like, yes, you lose that inner monologue, but I feel like it could have worked better because there are several points in the journal entry, book entry parts where they set up something where they're like, we'll never know how this happened because we weren't there.
Right.
Oh, never mind. Literally the next 3 pages are explaining what happened. And it kind of, like, if there had been that element of, like, what's it called? My brain is failing me. Like, an untrustworthy narrator.
Okay,
What's that
unreliable
called?
narrator.
Unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Thank you, listeners. My brain barely works, so you're going to have to bear with me sometimes. It could have added that, like, what's true, what's not. But when it goes and it's like, well, then Carrie floated her bed around the room, and you're like, oh, okay. Okay.
Got it. That makes sense. No, yeah, I understand that. I do like the fact that it's almost like a mystery novel in some ways because of those articles where it's like, you know, what was the true intention behind something? We'll never know because we weren't there. And then, like, that being like a clue of like, all right, so like this is getting me in the mindset of like we're about to explore like the real decisions behind that.
Just like a mystery novel where within the first few pages they go, she was telekinetic and killed everyone.
Before the days of spoiler alert at
Yeah.
the top of the page. All right, that's Sam. Any further feelings as far as the monologue, the internal monologues and narrative that way?
I did like that. I just, like I said, the only thing that I got hung up on was that the different voices, if you will, were not distinct enough for me to always recognize them
Yeah.
as different.
Definitely.
I do have to say though, as I was reading this, like, I would like get a couple chapters in, and I was like, wow. Like, this makes sense. Like, it makes sense why this book was so successful, having never read his first book. I'm like, now I get it. I get why he was such a huge hit, because this book is
it's
great. Like, the
super
storytelling.
compelling.
Yeah. And also, as I just found out as we sat down to record, that this book was written in the future, as it were. So it was actually published when?
1974, but written, correct me, Ben, if I'm wrong, 1979 is when it
takes place. Yeah.
Yeah.
And his wife, I want to add that part too, had to convince him to rescue it from the trash, is what I've also
Tabitha.
heard.
Shout out to Tabby. If
That's fantastic.
you're listening, thank you very much.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show, Tabitha King. Tell your husband we say hey.
Right, yeah. No, and that totally threw me, because in my head I was like, so the books, the first time you see each article or each book, it always has like the published date and it has all that information. So as I was going through and I was making my notes, I was like, all right, the furthest forward one I was seeing was 86. So in my head, it was like, all right, so this was probably written mid 80s. And then to find out that it was almost 10 years earlier than I assumed it was.
By the mid-'80s, Stephen King had written 40 books.
See, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about anything. So I'm learning so much in this show. All right, so you guys ready to jump into the story?
The very uncomfortable beginning of this
The
book.
most uncomfortable intro scene in anything?
Well, I don't know, because I still have not gotten my first period either, so.
Nobody tell her. She'll burn down the gym. Okay, so something I read online while researching that I think is kind of crazy is the origin of this book. Stephen King had been writing for a while. He'd written a bunch of short stories that he'd sold to like men's magazines and stuff. But the origin of this book was a bunch of his like readers and friends and whatnot were like, all your stuff is so like hyper masculine and violent, but you can't write about women. And he's like, oh yeah, well watch me. And this is what happened. Like
A scene
he's like
with pelting tampons.
yeah, I know women. They have periods and get really angry about it. That is the weirdest part of like
Bold
this entire
opening
book,
gambit.
is everyone's reaction. She got her period, and I'm furious. Like, maybe I don't understand women, but that's Stephen King's got some weird views about women, I think.
A lot of male authors do, it seems.
Yeah.
That's very true. Now, every time I and I said this before, every time I've seen this in pop culture, reading it, like, because it goes for like 20 pages. Like, it is not a short beginning where all this goes down, and it feels very Lord of the Flies to me. A little bit, like, in the way it escalates to an incredibly unsafe place so fast, where at first it's like, this is inappropriate, this is like, you feel really bad, and then all of a sudden you're like, this is not safe anymore.
Yeah.
Something terrible, if like nobody stops this, it is game over. And so that always, that was very very compelling as well as uncomfortable, and I thought that was a really strong lead-in.
One of the weird things I think about the beginning, one of my notes was like, does Stephen King like Carrie? Because he is, like,
That is a great question.
He is writing from the perspective of all of the girls that are torturing her, but all of the descriptions of Carrie White,
Yeah.
especially in the beginning, are brutally
brutal.
terrible. She's described as like bleeding bovinely, and like, Jesus Christ, does Stephen King have any sympathy for this character? Later on, I think maybe a little, but
Maybe he wanted us to feel the disgust that the characters felt for her in that moment.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Like, if we were to take it like just on his word that all these people are just always so terrible, and they establish pretty much every time they mention it that Carrie has done nothing to these people. She is just the person getting picked on for virtually no reason. So I think it's like trying to stack the deck against her to give her as many unlikable, like, those people that are like, I don't know that person, I don't like their face.
Yeah.
I don't like them. They seem like a jerk.
Because it
Like,
changes later, too. You kind of get it. You're like, wait a minute, I thought, oh, so she's not this
Yeah.
hideous creature?
Because when what's his name?
Is it Tommy?
Tommy.
Yeah, when later on in the book, Sue Snell feels bad about what these girls did and convinces her boyfriend to ask Carrie to the prom. Like, it's like he's describing a different person.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's jarring. Like, it's almost the first time in the book that she is described as not at least a little monstrous. Because even when she is alone, she's described as having this, like, she terrifies her mother. Well, her mother's a piece of shit and deserves to be terrified, but that's another topic. But yeah, it's kind of a 360. It's very strange.
Yeah. Well, now, so, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this. The teacher.
Oh yeah,
How do you guys
I
pronounce
have
her name?
no idea.
Desjardins.
Desjardins.
Desjardins. Yeah.
Mrs.
Desjardins.
D.
Miss D.
D.
Yeah, well, that'll be much better. Like when she comes in and slaps her across the face in the
Yeah.
shower, like where it's
Whoa.
like, all right, an adult's here, something's gonna happen, and then she just hauls off and just bam. And
Well, it is the 70s.
it is the 70s.
So you gotta hit women in the 70s.
It is the cure for hysterics. Everybody knows every movie where someone's hysterical, they get slapped in the face. That's the cure for
No
hysteria.
comment. Am I right, ladies?
And the fact that I'm like pulling from the book that it says that she hardly would have admitted the pleasure the act gave her. Like, even the teachers, like the people who are responsible for her, naturally don't like her.
Yeah. In that first bit, that first scene, I had written in my notes, who's the villain of this book?
Okay.
Because within the first 30 pages, the answer seems to be everyone. There are no good guys in this friggin' book.
Well, that's not necessarily true. Well,
okay.
Here's
Yeah.
okay. Here's the thing that I noticed. It like jumping, like for the assistant principal Morton.
Yeah.
Like, so we have that scene where they're talking and he forgets her name.
Carrie,
Real
Wright,
quick, can I
Cassie.
take a sidebar? There is one of my favorite things about King is he has, I'm sure CM, you know, he has a certain way of writing slang. He has Kingisms
Yes.
where he will describe someone in such a way that no human being has ever said anything ever. And in that scene, he is describing the assistant principal, and he says the principal thinks of himself as a really nice guy, but I'm sure the other students would describe him as, quote, that real ass jabber. What? That's not a phrase, Stephen King. He does that a lot. It's one of my favorite things.
That's it. I think of Christine when you say that. I was trying to bring back shitters, but no one's picking it up.
We'll just turn this into common language for our podcast going forward.
Beep,
Refer
beep,
to
Richie.
people
No,
ass
not a thing.
jabbers. Well, so we have, you know, that scene, and he sends her home, and that's the point where I kind of noticed on my second read through to prepare my notes, was that everybody is awful to Carrie when she's around. When Carrie's gone,
Oh, yeah.
as soon as she leaves,
Everyone's like, she's not that bad.
Well, the talk that Morton and Miss D have is like, you know, they have her back, like they're like trying to figure out what to do about this, and then like Miss D later with the detentions and like the punishments that she's putting on, like the people around her, and then Sue obviously with what she does, like the people are trying to. They want to do right by her, but for some reason, just when she's around,
They're not showing that kindness to her.
exactly.
Yeah, well, that's my argument is good intentions doesn't make a good guy. Like, Sue is like, I need to be absolved for this. I want to make penance. But she doesn't fucking go to Carrie and be like, sorry, at any point.
Right. Her
So-
plan is overly elaborate
Yeah.
to
You know,
apologize.
yeah,
At
I'm
best.
totally with her. I'd rather someone send me a hot dude than just.
Oh, fair, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. At best, this book has an okay guy. That's
Sure.
it. But
Although
everyone
when,
else is a villain.
when Chris's dad comes in, sorry, I'm sort of jumping ahead, threatening in the.
That scene is awesome.
Was it the principal or vice principal?
That was the principal.
Principal Gale.
Yes, when he stood up to him.
I-
And I couldn't
oh,
remember
man.
how that went. And so as I was reading it, I think like my heart rate was kind of going because I was like, yeah, get him. Stand up for it.
King is so good at writing characters that you just want to kick their throat in. Like, he's awesome at it. And that's such a short scene, but you're like, I fucking hate that guy. It's
God, yeah.
great.
Well, and it's great. Like I expected that scene to go the entire other way. Like I expected the lawyer to come in and just walk all over him, and then he just starts firing those shots off, and he like lists all of the disciplinary things, and then is like, "That's just your daughter, by the way. Like that's not a group of people. That's your bitch daughter."
Oh, and Chris is another one of those characters. She's just so fucking pointlessly evil.
Yeah,
like,
she has no redeeming qualities
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Margaret takes it though.
Oh,
She's-
yeah, definitely.
It,
Let's talk about Margaret White. Like,
Yes. Well, because after this, we get our first excerpt from The Shadow Exploded, which is of the books that he references. It's mostly The Shadow Exploded and My Name is Susan Snell. Like those are the ones that are most commonly mentioned. And so that's like the note that I made is as they're talking about Carrie's birth that the police arriving to see her in bed holding the baby
with a
a
knife.
knife.
with a knife.
Yeah.
And then basically says that because Margaret White is who she is, that she blocked ever having sex out of her mind.
Yeah. Thought she had cancer.
One
didn't know
of
she was
that is,
pregnant.
I wrote that down. Margaret White thought Carrie was cancer. That's grim.
Yeah.
That is some
God, I didn't even
dark
think about that.
shit. And that really informs like a lot of the book.
Yeah.
How she was treated, how Margaret thought of Carrie is she was a cancer on her life.
Yeah, she was evidence that Margaret was a sinner.
Yeah.
Yeah. God,
Fuck.
that's crazy.
That woman, the only other character he's written that has infuriated me as much as she does is, I can't remember her name, from The Mist.
I was
Oh,
just
yes.
about to say
Oh, yeah. that
religious
character is-
fundamentalism is like a recurring theme in his books. I don't remember, it's been a very long time since I've read this book, but The Dead Zone, there is a segment about Johnny's mother who is going senile and starts becoming very Margaret White-esque, and he writes that character so well and so evil.
Yeah.
I can't even-
It's that conviction is like the most evil thing. Like it's not even like, yes, the religious fanatics that he writes, but then there are other villains that just his best villains are the ones that believe they're doing the right thing, and that's the most dangerous thing you can be.
And are real. This
Yeah.
is a book about a girl who destroys, spoiler alert, destroys an entire town with telekinetic powers.
Ben, did you read ahead?
It's about this girl with like Phoenix Force style mental powers. And the scariest thing in the book is this insane woman who is just beyond sanity. Oh God.
There's no coming back from as far as she has gone. Like you can't return from the level of crazy that she is. Like there's no helping someone like that. There's no changing someone like that.
Which is why I think when we were discussing Carrie in our first meeting before we started this, Josh, and I said the scene that sticks out in my mind from the first time I read this book the most is the scene with the rocks.
Yes.
And you're like, really? It's not the scene at the prom with the blood? The scene that literally everyone knows? And I said, no, it's the scene with the rocks. Just stuck in my mind. And rereading that, it was the scene for the readers, where as a little girl, Carrie sneaks into a neighbor's backyard who's wearing a two-piece. And
Estelle Horan.
good notes.
Thanks.
And says that she'll never get boobs. She'll never get her dirty pillows because you only get boobs if you sin. And then rains rocks down on her house because her mother flips shit. And that scene is so just iconic.
The way I agree with you completely. And for me, that felt iconic and more devastating than the prom scene because it was easier to see that as something that could happen in real life. Not the stones, but that obvious child abuse going on there. And it's just
like the
so
character
heavy.
says, who's the, whatever her name is, Susan, says
Estelle.
it's Estelle. Yeah, that's it. She said she didn't do anything because it was too real. Her mother and her just watched as she heard Margaret yelling, "Get in your closet."
Yeah.
And the 300-pound table came flying through the window.
Okay, that was just, that was,
That's bonkers.
yeah. It's just too real. The abuse is what makes this book so, like, icky feeling. This book is kind of icky feeling. Is that just me?
It's kind of gross.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't leave you with a great feeling every night after you put it down.
Yeah, I believe Wikipedia, super great source.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show, Wikipedia. Tell your husband we say hey. says King describes it as raw and quote, with a surprising power to hurt and horrify. I think that's a super great way to put it.
That is a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Well, like when she comes home, when Carrie's mom comes home, because they say that, you know, the school called, and like you would assume that, you know, she's obviously, we've established Margaret is not a friendly or compassionate person, but you would assume you get a phone call that your daughter was, you know, insanely harassed, and was like sent home, and the first thing she does is walk across the room and backhand her across the face. Like it's just that shift. Like, I didn't know what to expect, but I did not expect to come out of the gate with a backhand to the face.
Yeah. Can we talk, while we're talking about that scene, how fucked the closet is?
Dude.
I looked up when it's describing what's in the closet. It says hung in the closet is this tract called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And I was like, that sounds bad. What's that? And I looked it up, and what it is a sermon from like colonial times, like colonial America. And essentially what the sermon of the sinner's hand in the hands of an angry God says is, if you are a sinner, God fucking hates you. You are cursed to hell, not only in hell, but on earth. That as a sinner, your life is a literal portion of hell, and at any second, at any time, for any reason, God's gonna fucking kill you.
Wow.
And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And how old was Carrie in the rock scene? She was 3?
No.
5?
In
Three.
the rocks. Was she 3?
She was 3.
Okay.
I believe, yeah.
Jesus Christ. She has been thrown in and locked in a closet regularly since she was 3 years old, with nothing but a tract that says, God will murder you.
Okay, I'm
Holy
about to get,
shit.
I'm about to get real, you guys.
All right, let's do
okay.
this.
I grew up in a religious family, and there was
Condolences.
thank you. There was a period of time where we went to church like 3 times a week, and I remember being so terrified sometimes because of all the more like Old Testament style fire and brimstone, we're all horrible talk. I would literally, I thought there were demons under my bed. I would leap from my doorway to my bed so they couldn't get me. It was like when I was maybe 5 years old. So of course I thought insane things. But
Sure, monsters exist.
so reading that was kind of like, took me back, made me feel a little bit traumatized.
Made you real happy you didn't have a closet like that in your house.
Yeah,
That was the,
yeah. No,
that was
it was
the important
nothing like
takeaway.
that, but just it was just really interesting.
Well, I'd like to lighten it up a little by asking you guys this question. I may have referred to it earlier today, but the question is Carrie X-Men fan fiction? Yes or no? My vote? Yes.
I mean, yeah, it is. It is a dramatic origin story of.
Well, Carrie's powers, the telekinesis, it is described in The Shadow Exploded, or I think there's one that's about telekinesis. I
about the
forget what it's
genes.
called. Yeah. Where it is a genetic disorder that expresses itself at puberty by stress, an extremely stressful situation. That is literally how the X-Men get their powers. So Carrie's an X-Man.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. She's a mutant.
Well, she would have been.
And, well,
Spoiler alert.
yeah, that's my theory.
No, that's.
And I would like everyone to read my fan fiction that I will be dropping online after this, in which at the prom Wolverine shows up.
I love that.
It makes him the only other survivor. Because he just crawls out with little skins growing back.
Keeps ripping his arms off, and he's like, "Mah, Wolverine!" I've read the X-Men. I know what he says.
Yep, that's classic Wolverine dialogue. I was waiting for your fanfic to be Carrie's entrance into the Dark Phoenix saga. Jean Grey's gaining all these powers, and then Carrie flies in.
Oh, shit. I'd watch that movie.
Carrie becomes the Dark Phoenix instead. As if she wasn't destructive enough. Now, so since we're like still kind of talking about the house a little bit, the description that she gives of like the closet is obviously terrifying, but just the description of the house, like
the ivy that looks like a hand coming out of the ground, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, and then like the giant crucifix and
Jesus,
all of the religious iconography all around. I think doesn't she say she has some in her room too?
Yeah, but it's all like
Is it the one with the lambs?
the lambs and the tamer stuff.
Yeah.
But the fact that her living room has all of these visions of I forget which ones they mention, but all of the more gory scenes from the Bible is pretty messed up.
Well, and they describe the giant crucifix like it's almost like a life-size crucifix in that in their living room. Like, this is
A
massive,
4-foot tall crucifix.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Something you'd find in a church in their living room.
right? Well, and this is when she gets home. I highlighted this in the clothes, like when she's undressing, and the list. Her blouse, her knee-length skirt, her slip, her girdle, her petty pants, her garter belt, her stockings, and then she just staring at this pile of massive clothes.
Yeah.
It's like so much of this. It's a small detail, but it says to me like everything in her existence weighs her down, and it's the emotional and the physical, like everything. No matter the angle, is just piled on her, and she carries this weight all the time. So when she feels that lightness, and it's always immediately after that, every time that she gets kind of like a chance to breathe, is when she grows. Like every little time, because that's when she starts flexing and starts moving things around.
There's some of the theme of sex in there too, because as soon as she takes it off, she describes her nipples in detail.
Yes,
but
That's
it's
how
kind of
women think, by the way.
Is
I'm
that?
always like, oh, my nipples. Yeah, totally. He nailed it. That's we always have this internal monologue going about our nipples.
But I mean, it ties into the theme that one of the themes of this book is sex is evil? ? Or if it's not evil, it's Carrie sees it as evil,
Or
and it's
is womanhood evil?
oof. King, come on.
Let's go down that rabbit hole, Sam.
There's actually another thing I read, also on Wikipedia, that in an interview with King. Oops, clicked on the Spanish Wikipedia. That doesn't help. He says, es una formación. He says that he wrote this book to be about feminism.
What?
Yeah. Well, think this book was written in the
early
mid-70s.
Yeah, the early 70s
during
feminism?
the women's rights movement. And he was like, yeah, I wrote this as like a man's perspective of what feminism means. And it's like, uh-oh, what you saying there, Stephen King?
Take that back. Would you kindly?
Yeah, well, Stephen is, if women become powerful, they will menstruate and then burn a school to the ground. Like, what? Don't know what you're talking about there, Stephen King, but...
Well, and it's not just with Carrie, like the, who is it? Tommy and Sue, when they're having sex. And like, they like, at first it's kind of like an adorable, like they're figuring it out. And there's that kind of like, it's, young love and stuff. And then the line that I highlighted of the idea that she had to let him fuck her.
Oof.
Because he was popular and she was popular. So to be
she is
a
like
popular
railing
couple,
against that. though. So I guess that's good.
It's just before she starts making that turn to feel bad about stuff. Like
Yeah.
that's where this conversation happens, is just after they have sex and she says that.
Because none of them are in control of their own sexuality. It's thrust upon them, like, to
that's
their
true.
complete surprise, or they feel obligated to provide it,
And then they
or they use it to.
try to take control, and then everyone dies. Is that the point that he's trying to
Is
make?
that sex kills?
Sex is bad.
Okay,
you
that
guys.
makes sense. I think we nailed it.
Yeah, I think we finally
We
came
got to the
around
bottom
what
of it.
this is really all about. So then the scene with Sue and Tommy, and this is where the ball gets rolling about like where her plan starts forming. She doesn't lay out the plan here, but it's where she, Tommy actually talks her into, like, you should, if you feel bad, you should do something about that, which I also like made me really like Tommy immediately, is that he was not. She describes him as, while she's talking about the sex, like she talks about the superficial, the popularity stuff, and then in that conversation, becomes a real person. Like he's like they're having that one-on-one conversation, and you're like, he's Tommy's kind of a good guy.
Yeah, the guy. There's one good guy. It's a guy.
In the story about feminism, the guy's the good guy who talks sense into his hysterical post-coital girlfriend.
Yeah, I think there is a line where he says, she's like, "Oh, but you're just Mr. Popular," and he's like, "Hey, you're the one all hung up on being popular. I'm just a cool guy."
I'm just
Have I
super
mentioned this
cool.
book is kind of icky? Like,
Well, and I can't remember which article or excerpt it is, but his motives or his kindness is then questioned. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
that's right.
She, because Sue says something in her book to the effect of like,
Everyone
he
was-
did it because he loved me, and they're like, how do you know? And like, well, he told me, and if you knew Tommy, you'd know that was enough.
yeah.
And it was like a nice, simple thing of like, a good way kind of to inform the character, because I had that question too. I was like, I wonder what his real like motives are. How does he really feel? And like that just little bit just like made me take, all right, everything Tommy says, I'm just taking it at face value.
And that's another part of what I was talking about, of that unreliable narrator that is just instantly shoved aside. Where it's like, well, they have this segment where Sue's like, he was a nice guy, and everyone else is like, but was he? And then the book's just like, yeah, he was.
Yeah.
So kind of
was.
undoes all of that narrative work.
Well, and his description of Carrie, if I remember correctly, is the only one that is kind. I mean, seeing,
Oh yeah, when
Carrie
he goes
through
to
his eyes,
ask her, when
we
he goes
see
to like
a
ask her
different
to
description.
Yeah,
the
the-
prom. Yeah.
When he sees her, and she's like, oh,
But I did
kind of pretty.
I did highlight one piece of his dialogue that now I'm like thinking about it as I said he's a good guy. Where he said, when he's talking about, he tells the story about how he kicked that kid in the ribs.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Kicked that kid and ran because that kid was like a bully. But then when he's talking to her and he says, it's not 7th grade anymore, and I had some kind of reason, even if it was a piss poor reason. What did that sad, silly bitch ever do to you?
Now that I have this thing where I
Imagine
think
that conversation in the car.
I have this thing where I think movies should the title of every movie should be its best line of dialogue. My classic example is the movie You've Got Mail should be called Hello, It's Mr. Nasty. And I think that should be the title of Carrie. It should be called That Sad Silly Bitch.
Sad, silly bitch.
So I think we're getting here now that the plot is rolling, that Tommy asks Carrie out, and we get to the point where we briefly mentioned what's her name, the bad guy, Chris. Chris's father tries to sue the school but doesn't get his way.
Gets
and
shut the fuck down.
Chris gets banned from prom, and so she is swearing revenge on Carrie and the school to a lesser extent.
Yeah.
What I'd like to talk about is one of the other villains and another kingism. Why is Billy a greaser?
Thank you.
That is a very weird. He like down to like reading Popular Mechanics, like standing in
Yeah.
the corner. Like
I couldn't help but thinking of like Sometimes They Come Back.
Henry Bauer popped to mind
Yes, yeah.
immediately. But Henry Bauer in It takes place in the 50s, where greasers existed. In this book, it is 1979, and Billy's like, "Hey, yo, I'm Danny Zuko over here." Also famously played in the movie by John Travolta.
what? Wait.
Yeah.
Wait.
In the Sissy Spacek, Brian De Palma, Carrie movie, Billy is played by John Travolta. I wish
the
I had
show.
brought my copy of the
John
book.
Travolta,
It
friend
is
of the
the
show.
movie version, and in the middle of the book has a bunch of stills from the movie, including a hilarious picture of John Travolta.
When we get finished reading this, I want to watch that. I want to rewatch it because I also haven't seen that movie in so long.
I don't
Yeah.
believe I've ever seen it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
So,
Movie night.
well, yeah, movie night, guys. Woo!
And then we have this is something else, like now we're like we have this plot development. I have another thing that I highlighted that comes from her Susan Snell book. In the wake of 200 deaths and the destruction of an entire town, it's easy to forget one thing. We were kids. We were kids trying to do our best. And like as I read that and I like stopped for a minute and I was like, oh fuck. Like yeah, they are like 16 years old.
Yeah. Their
Like,
brains are not
they
even
are-
fully developed yet.
Right. Like it explains, you know, the like especially like Chris, like how fast she jumps to the cruelest possible option, and that kind of thing. It's just really interesting to me. Like you forget. It's kind of like I referenced Lord of the Flies earlier. Like you forget over the course of these things, the actions that people take. That like, oh my God, these are children, and
But-
they're so vicious.
Yeah, I find it hard to excuse that by how absolutely brutal the shit that these kids do are. Like, there's only so far that you can take, kids will be kids. That goes out the window when they are slitting a pig's neck and draining it of all of its blood. Like,
Classic pranks.
classic pranks.
Classic pranks. And doing it while that farmer is at his mom's funeral. That, like, I was like,
Weird detail,
fuck
yeah.
Fuck you, Stephen King. That's a weird choice. And then that, like, but it lets them end with that joke of, like, she must have been, 1,000 years old. Haha, as we drive away with our trunk full of pig blood. So let's, as we end the part one, we're getting all the pieces are starting to take place. We've got Carrie going to prom. We've got Chris stealing the ballot, and then we've got the what's his name, Billy and his crew.
Wait, does she actually steal the ballot, or does she just see it and that's what inspires her?
No, she takes it. She takes there because it's a sample copy, and she takes.
Okay,
There's
I
like,
missed
I think
that.
there's several, and she just
Once again, I read this book at 4 a.m.
because it says I think it says she shoves it in her purse.
Gotcha.
Like there was like some other papers, and she shoved it in her purse. While
An unimportant detail that I'm sorry I brought up. Let's continue.
But of all of those details that are about to set up our finale here, the thing that I found the most satisfying, it was Carrie standing up to her mom.
Yes.
And like her mom going to swing at her and she stops her arm in midair.
The image of her mother on her knees and Carrie saying, "Stand up," and just I can imagine her like just being lifted into the air. Such a satisfying part.
Right.
Where you're like, yeah, get it, girl.
Yeah, shit's gonna go down, and like throwing shit around like that. We've spent all this time her like flexing a little bit, and then it just before that she talks about the mental dam burst, and she starts remembering all the things she's done all her whole life that have been with this gift. But her taking it out on her mom right there,
So good.
so
Very
satisfying.
satisfying, yeah.
And then when she goes downstairs to get the material, and she can hear her mom doing the exorcism prayer above
Ooh,
her, and I was
yeah.
like, yeah, fuck that bitch.
Good book, guys. I'm excited to read the second half. I As much as I feel like we did kind of shit on this book a little bit.
I don't think we did. I think that just shows how much it has affected us just in part one.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So
CM, you got to. I
yes.
see you have your notes there.
but we can save this for the next one because we're out of time here. So maybe you guys just pay attention to the Dark Tower tie-in. See if you catch it.
All right, yeah.
We actually talked
CM
about
teased this before the show. Said she had a Dark Tower tie-in.
Yeah.
Kinda talked
Can I
about
make a
doing
guess?
that.
Can I make
All
a
you
guess
avid
as to what it
listeners.
was?
Sure.
And it's such a small thing, but it made my ears prick up that at one point a character is listening to Hey Jude.
No.
No?
Oh,
okay.
Oh man.
Yeah, right?
I didn't even think about that. All right, so we'll dive into that after we finish up the second half of Carrie, and we'll have our kind of open discussion about kind of everything we've covered today and more things that have come to us as we cover the second half. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in to our first episode of Derry Public Radio. I've been Joshua Kahn, along with Benjamin Graham, CM Alexander. You guys want to say goodbye to the people?
Long days and pleasant nights.
Good night!
Hey everyone, this is CM Alexander. Thank you so much for listening to our very first episode, Carrie Part 1. We sincerely hope you enjoyed it, and if you didn't, we will do better next time. Our next episode will cover the rest of the book, parts 2 and 3, and we're also going to watch the movie and have a brief discussion about movie versus book. We hope you'll read along with us and or watch the movie, even if you're already familiar with Carrie, because it's really interesting and cool and definitely worth a second go, or if you're like us, a third or fourth go. If you want to reach us for any reason, you can do so on Facebook at Derry Public Radio, on Twitter at Derry Public, and for some reason on Instagram at Derry Public Radio. And if social media is not your thing, you can send us an email at derrypublicradio@gmail.com. Thanks again for checking out our first episode. We hope you'll join us for the second.